Hello and good day to you. This is Mr. Ludvigson with the presentation title MTss 504 IEP. What does that stand for again? In education, we love our acronyms and you tend to hear a lot of them. So this presentation is kind of an overview, scratching the surface of some of these terminologies. It's intended to get you familiar and kind of touch the first surface on a few things. It's not intended to be a deep dive into any of these particular programs. So if you're a teacher, board member, administrator, this is designed to just kind of go quickly through how these things work. If you're in special ed, you might gain some knowledge on some of the programs that lead up to where you're at. But keep in mind, this is not intended as a deep dive. My name is Daniel Ludvigson. I am superintendent and elementary principal of Elgin New Leipzig Public School. I have also been a president of our special ed association for a few years and have served 9 years, kind of going on 10, transitioning out of being an MTSS and 504 coordinator. So I've been in a lot of meetings for special ed, a lot of meetings for 504s, tier 1 and tier 2 plans for MTSS. So I've gained a lot of knowledge along the way about how these different programs interact and interconnect. And I can tell you it's very important for these programs to be synergistic, to help each other out versus compete with one another. If you don't take a look at how these programs operate, you can overlap services and you could be being highly inefficient, more or less. So a student could be getting help for the same exact thing when perhaps they need more different type of help from one program to the next. It's one reason I'm an advocate of MTSS and getting everybody involved on that team. But you know, for a lot of the parents out there, they just really want their kid to get help and they're not familiar with these various terms. And it can be very tempting to like say, you know, I just need help. How do I get that? And hopefully this presentation sheds light a little bit on how these things interact and function. So first off, why do we have so many different and varied programs? It's a very good question. First off, we have kind of the continuum I consider general education, which is education for everyone. And let me emphasize that everyone part of the statement. That includes your IEP students, 504s, and all these categories we're talking about. General education is education for everyone. On the far end of the spectrum, we have special education, or I like to point out specialized instruction. Students in this category need specialized instruction to experience the same success as a general education. And I'll get more into that later. But as you can see here, we have a whole bunch of in-between programs. And this is where you get the most gray and the most overlap. But you can kind of consider that middle group to be your at-risk population. Those are the students they generally talk about falling between the cracks. They don't quite qualify for special education. Perhaps they don't have a learning disability or other qualifying factor, or perhaps their needs aren't as high. But most of the at-risk programs are targeting those students. And sometimes they call them bubble kids because a lot of the programs will target students who are just below proficiency level, but perhaps don't qualify for another program. Now, ideally, your general education program should be taking care of at least 80% of your students without need for the special programming, up to ideally 90%. And then your special ed population ideally should be sitting at between 5 and 10%. So like if you have 60% of students getting their needs met by general education and 40% in various intervention programs, that probably means you have a curriculum problem. It probably means that you aren't really experiencing that many needs. You have a different problem and you should address that if you want to see those numbers change. And you know, things aren't always straightforward as that, but that's a good rule of thumb. Now depending on your distribution, your at-risk might be 15%, and your special ed 5, your special ed 10, and at-risk 5. It just depends. That's just kind of a range. It's not a hard number, but if you see a large percentage of students not getting their needs met by the general instruction, then you probably have a curriculum problem. And keep in mind, general education includes those accommodations and modifications a teacher already does in the classroom. You know, having somebody sit up close to the front, or chunking problems, different things, rereading instructions, providing visuals. There's a lot of interventions that do fall within the classroom. But keep in mind with when I talk about that risk and I threw out that percentage, like, you know, there are some programs that aren't necessarily hitting students at risk of failing, which is where that term comes from. They might be providing extra assistance to other students, but I'm not going to try to hit a general percentage of how many students should be having those sorts of needs met. And we could also have a talk between, you know, academic needs versus social emotional needs versus behavioral needs. But this is a general overview, so we won't like get too drilled down into that, but to go into it a little bit more. General education serves all students. It doesn't have any gatekeeping criterion or testing requirements. Everybody receives it. And that's one of the characteristics of general education. Now you might have to your MTSS plans, and some of those will still fall into general education. They're still part of your general education program. In particular, if they're happening in the classroom and the teacher is handling them without additional support, just because they have some different approaches in there does not necessarily mean it's not falling within general education. But by and large, that means your needs are being met in the classroom. That's why I'm pointing out that, you know, teachers do interventions all the time. And if that is all being taken care of within the classroom, you are probably falling into general education. A quick note on general education, generally the interventions in play are considered good faith efforts. There's no legally binding aspect to them. There's no mandatory meetings or things like that. There might be meetings and stuff going on, but it's all on the part of the school district to arrange those and execute those. There isn't something saying that you have to do these steps. At-risk programming, that name comes from the term that these are students that have various characteristics that put them at risk. So a student who has an English language learner issue because their first language wasn't English is at risk for failing. So that's an at-risk program. Title services, particularly targeted title services, are looking for students that are below grade level on multiple measures. They're at risk. And there's several different qualifications that can be taken a look at, but in general, at-risk program isn't as strict as 504s or IEPs, but there is generally some gatekeeping going on. For example, if you're in a targeted title school, you do have to show that below proficiency on a few measures. If you're getting a ELL plan, requires you get a certain score in the WIDA to show that you have a lack of proficiency there. The requirements for getting on an at-risk programming, I'd also throw 504s in there as it varies. And some of them are less strict and some of them are more strict, but generally there is some sort of requirement in order to fall into those at-risk types of programs. And finally, special education. The big thing I want you to get out of what I have to say about this is that special education requires special instruction. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with intelligence, or the student can be a very good academic student, but perhaps they have a particular subject that for whatever reason is a big struggle for them. They need specialized instruction in that area to be as successful as the general education population. There's some sort of barrier there present, and there's very strict gatekeeping criterions. There's needs for evaluations. The document that you create is legally binding, and in order to make changes, you need to get parents together and have a meeting on there. Keep in mind, in North Dakota, like social, emotional, or behavioral are categories that have qualifications for IEPs, but in this state, it's very difficult to get one strictly for those things. A lot of times the students identified as having a learning need, and then they have behavior plans in addition to help address their issues in the classroom. But in order for those categories to qualify for special ed, it needs to be impeding their learning. So that's very important. There has to be something, even if it's not a specified learning disability, that is getting in the way of learning. So keep that in mind. We'll go into that a bit more. And so I have this rather popular slide that I'm sure a lot of you have seen before, but equality versus equity. Now, the thing to keep in mind with all these programs, general education included, general education at risk, or special education is that they're all designed to try to help kids be successful in the classroom. And they're all trying to address different factors that can create difficulties in learning and trying to remove those and put students on equal footing. Now, there's various versions of the graphic here provided to illustrate that idea. But what I want you to get out of this for this presentation is that the needs of our children are not all the same. They're not all cookie cutter. And even in your general ed populations, teachers are doing various interventions, just maybe on a smaller scale to help all students be successful. So when you look at that continuum of services, so to speak, and where a student falls, the major point is that there are different kinds of needs and they originate from different sources, and how you address them is different. So please keep that in mind. And we'll proceed on to a little bit more about special education. So moving into special education. First off, special education falls under the law IDEA and also free and appropriate education, FAPE. Those are very important in regards to this. It's federally funded. So if you don't follow rules under IDEA or FAPE, that there are circumstances in which your federal funding can be affected. The bulk of students who are qualify for IEP services, like I said before, fall into the learning disabilities category. An important thing to understand is that is a discrepancy between the student's ability and their performance. So it's very possible to have a student that has low cognitive abilities across the board that does not qualify for special education because there isn't a discrepancy in their performance versus their ability. It's also equally possible that a student has a very high ability, but they have a specific issue with reading or mathematics or something of the sort that makes learning in a specific area very difficult for them. So being qualified for an IEP has nothing to do with your intelligence level. It has to do with requiring specialized instruction. And so that's one thing I want you to make sure that you get out of this. Having an IEP is not a label that you are dumb or otherwise. It's just saying that you need specialized instruction. Now, this is governed with Individuals with Disabilities Act, and so that's important. The point of that legislation is that we provide a free and appropriate education for all students, meaning that you need to have appropriate placement for the student. So if the students can get their needs met in the classroom with supports and whatnot, generally that's considered the least restrictive environment. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. You don't want to be pulling students out of the regular classroom just because they have an IEP. We need to assess their needs. As you know, IEPs involved having an individualized education plan, and there's requirements for certain team members to be on that. Special education, teachers, administration, and parents, just to name some required members. And when you make the decision to put somebody on an IEP, off an IEP, or change the IEP, you need to have a meeting. The document you create is legally binding, so when you are creating an IEP, you need to be very cognizant of the types of words you're using. Because if it says student will be pulled out for testing, that means students will be pulled out for testing. It shouldn't be an option. Versus if it says student will be pulled out for testing as necessary, that leaves some judgment up to the teacher. And whether or not one scenario or the other is better is just dependent on the student and their needs. Sometimes you want it to not really be a choice, and sometimes you want to leave some discretion up to the professionals that are carrying out the education plan. So, like with IEPs, something that commonly gets misunderstood is that not every diagnosis or thing that impedes learning is in fact something that qualifies for specialized instruction. Just to give some examples, ADHD is an issue with regulating attention. If you remove that barrier, the person does not have an issue with learning. Dyslexia, which can often be accompanied by a reading disability, is not in of itself considered a learning disability. Now I know as I say this, it's not black and white. And a lot of these things, they use the term comorbid. So a lot of times you might have attention deficit disorder and a learning disability, or autism and a learning disability. Now, autism is kind of the odd duck in this list here because autism is a category in which a student can qualify, but it's a spectrum disorder. So like it needs to be impeding learning, as I say. Like some students who have autism might have different social needs or different tactile needs, but they might not have an issue with learning itself. So they would fall more appropriately under a different program. So in this presentation, I am not commenting on how hard you should try to get somebody in an IEP or what sort of processes you use to try to get them on an individual education plan. I'll talk into 504, but like I'm talking about their general purposes of these programs. I know some people have opinions on how you can get people on an individual education program and when it's appropriate. This presentation is simply about what characterizes them. So major points. Learning disabilities are discrepancies in performance and ability. So if you are going to make a referral to special education, this is generally speaking the category that you're going to be looking for. Now, like I said, there are categories, other categories. I'm not going to go into them. I know behavioral can be one, but like I said, it needs to be documented over a long period of time, and you have to demonstrate it's directly interfering with learning. For our younger students up to the age of 9, they can also be non-categorical, meaning you don't have to identify a specific area. You can have data demonstrating a need over several areas and that some sort of learning concern is present. And the reason they do that is it can be kind of hard to identify it in those like kindergarten, first grade students and those other ones. But as they get older, eventually they'll need to label it as a learning disability, potentially autism. Like I said, sometimes that is a qualifying factor, but it's not a given. But so IEPs are about discrepancies in ability that require specialized instruction. Most of the time that is the category. There are other ones. Being on an IEP does not necessarily mean you're a poor student. So strictly speaking, your students failing multiple classes may be an indication they need an IEP, but it is not, grades aren't a very good indication that a learning need is present. Some students work really hard and it's harder for them and they spend 3 times as long on their homework, and they do have a learning need. They just have perhaps better coping skills. And it's equally possible that a student is failing classes simply because they're not turning things in and they're not putting in the work. And that's not necessarily a learning problem. That's a different kind of problem. And like I said before, it's not an intelligence thing. It means you need specialized instruction. You may be even in a gifted and talented program. Not all things that impair learning are a learning disability. That is important to understand. Like a lot of people will come to me wanting to find services for their kid and they get a medical diagnosis of one sort or another. Well, not all those things fall into special education. Now, the other major point I want to make before moving on is that as a school district, when you're making a referral to specialized instruction to get an IEP, one of the first things that's going to be taken a look at is what are you doing in the classroom? What are those general education interventions or at-risk interventions that you already have in place? Generally speaking, a child is not going to qualify or at least start the evaluation process if the school district can't demonstrate it's been trying something else first. So like just because a student's failing classes doesn't mean you get an instant referral. Like if they're going to ask, are they doing things like moving the kid up to the front of the room? Are they providing small group instruction? Is the teacher doing things like scaffolding or chunking or different things? And just to keep in mind that a lot of people are doing those things, but they don't always give themselves credit for it. So if you are a special ed teacher, 504 coordinator, or MTSS coordinator, I highly recommend having checklists and different things that you can provide teachers, because A lot of times when you ask them what accommodations they're providing, they might not think about moving them up in front of the classroom, providing visuals, those sorts of things, because a lot of that is good quality instruction. And that can also be a really useful tool for when you find a student's really successful with one teacher, but not another teacher. Sometimes using those tools and surveys can be a helpful way to kind of dig at what is the difference. And so that is kind of special education in a nutshell. Again, caveat there, I'm not a special education teacher. This is sort of my perspective as an administrator, MTSS coordinator, 504 coordinator. But those are some general points and things to keep in mind. With that, we'll move into 504 plans. First and foremost, 504 plans are a civil rights compliance act governed under section 504. Disabilities, Individuals with Disabilities Act. So this isn't necessarily something related to having a learning problem. Generally, the things that fall into this category may interfere with learning. They provide a barrier to learning. They make it more difficult to access the curriculum, things like that. And 504 plans are for targeting getting the same access, providing the same opportunity. It's you don't get on a 504 because you have a specific learning disability, though things like ADHD, autism, those various things can get you a 504. But there are situations in which, you know, the difference between an IEP and a 504 are fairly subtle. Administratively, 504 plans are non-funded. You don't get any special funding to carry out 504s, have staff to carry them out. You are required to have a 504 coordinator, and you are required to do the same thing as for special education students, and that is a child fine. And I'm not sure how many districts are very good about that, but like child fine doesn't only apply to special education, you also need to do it for 504s. A rather interesting trait about 504s is that the school district is required to provide equal access and equal opportunity in education, regardless of parental consent. And what I'm getting at with that is you are required to provide accommodations to level the playing field, so to speak, whether or not a parent agrees. So if you suspect a child has a disability and you have signs and reason to believe it, and you don't make accommodations, you are technically legally liable for the education of that child. So that's why on the bottom there you see do not require parental consent, because you can have a 504 without getting authorization from a parent because of what I just said. You are required to invite them to participate. You are required to allow them to provide input. But if the parent denies services, unlike an IEP, the school district still has an obligation to meet the child's need. So kind of an interesting quality of 504 plans. And this is something that often gets overlooked for the parents out there. You don't get a 504 by having a doctor write a note. I've seen that before where, you know, a doctor sends something in and says this child should be placed on a 504 and here are the accommodations you should be providing them. That sort of stuff is very useful. You should get that doctor in contact with the 504 coordinator by all means. But how you qualify for a 504, basically the 504 coordinator has to kind of review the child's information and identify if they have something that interferes with a major life function. Now, generally speaking, it's considered best practice to get a medical diagnosis if you have attention deficit disorder, depression. All kinds of things can fall into categories that will interfere with learning, concentration. There's various categories that you can fall into, but basically anything that's going to present a barrier. And to kind of explain from the slide before, it's kind of like glasses. I don't have a vision problem, but these help prevent glare. But a person that needs glasses doesn't have a learning disability. They need glasses and then they have equal access. So you might run into students that maybe need a color overlay or things like that. And if you provide those things, they don't really have an issue in the classroom. So that's kind of what 504s are targeted at. Now, sometimes we use 504s to piggyback off IEPs, like you have a group of students that are receiving individual instruction with a teacher, and you have a 504 student that's at a similar ability level, a similar academic need, but perhaps there isn't a learning need present there, thus they have a 504, not an IEP. You can use a 504 to have the student participate in those services, but you couldn't have the group just for the 504 students. So that's why I kind of call it piggybacking. So you can use 504s to create kind of a piggyback situation, and sometimes that's a good way to get special education staff involved with students that have specific needs and they have specialized abilities to help address those needs. But in general, 504s are more meant for access. But like I said, things aren't always clear cut. And sometimes because of that disability, they have fallen behind and they need some catch-up work. But 504s really aren't intended to have the curriculum changed or modified, just to clarify. 504s are intended to provide accommodations. Now, you can provide that kind of like tier 3 level support where you do get some extra supplemental instruction from joining a special education group or other intervention teacher. But in general, 504s are intended for students that have an access issue. For example, I worked with a student that had an auditory closure problem. When we list accommodations like repeat the instructions, make sure you're not in a room with a lot of echoing, various things like that, a lot of the learning needs we saw kind of dissipated and they did quite well in the classroom. Didn't require an IEP, just required certain accommodations due to their hearing issue. So 504s are not necessarily learning disabilities. In fact, they shouldn't be, because then you should be looking at a IEP situation. However, due to that does not require parental consent. These are sometimes used when a parent refuses services and you know that a disability is present. And so you can still have a 504 to meet those needs. However, that being said, I highly recommend that you get parents involved, make them a part of your team. I'm not by no means recommending that you use this to circumvent getting those things. However, they are an option, they are a tool. And sometimes this allows you to access some services, even if you're running into some of those roadblocks. Again, you're not required to have a medical diagnosis. It's preferred, but if several of your staff members pretty much consider the person as struggling with attention deficit disorder, and it's kind of assumed, technically that's good enough for a 504. So keep in mind, if you're treating someone like they have a disability, under Section 504, that means that they are covered, that they are subject to those civil rights compliance features. So briefly, I'll talk about individual health plans. Now, these are considered 504s, and I've gotten different recommendations on this, whether or not to call it a health plan or just call it a 504/health plan. Presently, I'd recommend you still calling them a 504, but specifying that it's a health plan. And the difference between a health plan and your standard 504 is that it's a medical need of some sort, or perhaps temporary, like breaking your leg, you might need extra time to get to a classroom, assistance carrying books, things like that. Perhaps you recently suffered from a concussion, and you have a period of time where you might need dimmer lights, reduced noise, things like that, but you don't have a learning problem. Or the other one is like something like diabetes. Perhaps you need an insulin shot, and if you don't get it, there could be a medical emergency. Allergies is a good example of that. So I'll use allergies as an example. You might have a health plan on file for what to do if your student goes into epileptic shock. And what that health plan serves as is a plan on how to address this health need. And if your staff follow the health need as determined, and they do all the steps, and God forbid something horrible happens, that provides protection because you did your due diligence, you tried your best to meet the need, and you followed the plan. By the same token, if you have a plan and you neglect to follow it, you would be considered liable in that situation. So like A lot of health plans commonly involve, how do you address the health need? What's your plan? It might be something that you just put on or that's just kind of an emergency situation, and when your child has an epileptic shock or a seizure or something like that, this is what the plan is. You might involve a nurse or medical professionals in writing that. If you have a school nurse, you should be very involved in that. But these aren't necessarily learning concerns. These are more like having either the access due to having a temporary condition like a broken leg. Some people would ask, do you need to write a health plan every time somebody has a broken leg or different things, or you just go and do it? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to tell you which one's right. I can tell you that I don't personally write a health plan every time we have something like that, but if you have a long-standing issue, particularly if it is causing a problem, like a concussion, I do highly recommend taking the time to visit and writing some stuff down. Health and 504 plans, to change them, you should technically have a meeting, and you should review them once a year. You can do like reviews on files sometime, take a look, has anything changed, that sort of stuff. And it's not as stringent as an IEP, but they are supposed to be periodically revisited and determine if they're still necessary, if any changes need to be met. 504s are legally binding documents, so anything you put in them is something that you're saying that you plan and intend to do, and you're bound by it. You need to keep that in mind. So just kind of reiterate, specifically on 504s, I would put these at the at-risk category because they don't fall under individuals with, they don't fall under IEPs, so they're slightly different. It's primarily a civil rights statute. Schools, regardless of parental input, are required to provide equal access. So if you have a student that has needs, is failing because the needs aren't being met, technically, according to Section 504, you're still required to come up with a plan, whether or not mom and dad want to be a part of it. Again, you want them a part of it if at all possible, just good to know. And as I was saying, these are legally binding documents. Make sure what you put in them is what you're going to do. That's why if you have like MTss programs and things like that, it's a great way to start some interventions. And if you see those are needed for a long term, switch it over to a 504, because then you've kind of tried things and you toss things in and out. When you get to a 504, if you say you're doing it, you should be doing it. It's not like an MTss plan where like you can kind of tweak things as you go and make some professional judgments. No, you're really required to revisit it, have a meeting, make adjustments, send notices out, those sorts of things. So just some things to keep in mind. All right, so I'm going to transition a little bit into some things that are more in general education. Again, I'll reiterate, I'm not saying these things are black and white, clear cut. There is overlap and gray areas. The purpose of this presentation is to give kind of a scratch of the surface, an overview, and what they're intended for. Now, Title I, you have two types of programs, school-wide and targeted. School-wide is services for all students, so it really kind of end up being more of a general education support. Well, targeted is very much an at-risk. You need to score low on one or more measures, or on more than one measure is what I mean. And schools can have different criterion for that and set up some of their own gatekeeping features. But generally, if you're school-wide, that's generally because your school has a high poverty rate. So it's still, even when it's school-wide, kind of an at-risk category anyway, even though it's providing general education support, because it's still trying to target an at-risk population. If the school is basically identified as having a large poverty population, they just remove the gatekeeping criterion to try to make it available to everyone, versus where if the school doesn't have that particular at-risk category, they go with targeted instead, and they just targeted those students that meet criterion set out by the school based on more than one standardized measure. And how this looks in schools can vary. Some schools use title supports to put in extra paraprofessionals, teachers. Some have set aside time. You do generally have a coordinator and some instructors. So that's a little bit about title program. Now, MTS, RTI, BLAST, whatever the name, this is something that tends to have its name changed periodically. When I was originally trained, it was called RTI. Now we have MTSS. And you know what those stand for is really not too important. And sometimes their name changes based on, as you can see down here, if it's based on academic behavior, social, emotional learning. Some have 2 components, some have all 3. Some have separate processes for each one. Some throw them all together. For example, at my school, when we meet for MTSS meetings, we talk about all 3. You might go to another district and they have a separate category for academic needs and another category for behavior, and you might go to school that has all 3. But all these all these different intervention programs have one thing in common, in that they are considered general education support. And so important thing to keep in mind is you don't RTI a kid, you don't MTSS a kid. Those terms are for the program at large. It's your system for meeting students' needs. It's not a designated time. You might have win times or other things where you provide supports for the students at those times. You do the interventions, you give them extra math, extra reading, but that time frame is not MTSS or RTI. That's just your structure for when it's being delivered. If you're carrying out MTSS and RTI or whatever it is with Fidelity, teachers are also doing interventions in the classroom because, as I said, they're tier 1 supports. And that's why it's great to have those surveys when you're doing things like MTSS, like if you're referring a student to the system in your school, and they can kind of mark what kind of things they're already doing in the classroom. This can help you avoid providing suggestions to the teacher that they are already doing. Same can be true for any of the other programs I talked about, but like having those surveys, like I said, a lot of times teachers won't necessarily give themselves credit for, giving kids extra time on tests, allowing to redo work, things like that. They're just doing it because they're a good instructor. So sometimes having those checklists can avoid the problem of, being asked, well, what are you doing in the classroom different for this child? And, they say, well, nothing really, I'm just doing the same thing I do for everyone else. That may or may not really be true. Hence, I think it's good to have kind of a form so you can check those things that you are perhaps doing. But because you're a good instructor, you just don't really think about it. It's just what you do. Again, various names for all these things. These are good faith effort type things. So if you have an MTSS plan, BLAST plan, whatever it is, they're not legally binding. No one can take you to court because you don't do exactly what's said in it. Bear in mind, you don't want to have a plan that you're not following, because why even put it on paper? You could at least not have killed a tree. But they're a good faith effort. So they serve as a pretty good transition leading into an IEP or a 504, because it allows you some time to try interventions, give a couple weeks, and try something else. Because you don't have those mandatory meeting requirements, there's a little more flexibility. It's easier to change things on the fly as you see things develop and give things a try, because you're not constantly needing to update a document. If something doesn't precisely meet up, you're still going to be okay. Also, MTSS programs can be a great way to create paperwork that you've been trying interventions. Perhaps you have those win times and the child has been receiving 20 minutes of support every day, 5 days a week for the last year and a half, and they are still struggling in reading. That can provide pretty powerful support that a learning need is going on. Also, very important if you have these programs, sometimes they look at whether or not a child is failing, and that can end up being kind of a gatekeeping requirement in IEPs, not generally speaking, but you might have a child that is being successful, but they're having very intensive supports. Maybe they've been at tier 3 interventions where they're getting pulled out support, they're getting targeted instruction 5 days a week for the last 2 years, and the teacher's doing this, that, these, and those, chunking, constantly reminding to stay on task, doing a lot of things. And the child is successful with those accommodations, but generally speaking, things in MTSS, RTI, their intention is to intervene early so the child makes growth and can go back into general education and doesn't need those supports. So that is the general purpose of those programs. So when you see somebody that's on an MTSS plan for several years, there's probably a learning need going on. And the great thing is, if you keep good documentation and you show all the interventions that are being in place, all the supports you're providing, that child does not need to fail in order to be identified as having a learning disability. They do not have to fail. You can simply provide the evidence that this child would fail should the school district discontinue the services it's providing. And I think that is a fairly big deal and something to keep in mind. Sometimes if you don't have these programs in place, it might functionally be that the child has to start actually failing classes before they're considered as having a need that's not being met. But if you're keeping good records and you have these programs in place, you're not required to let the child fail in order to get them services. So that brings me into English language learners. Quick caveat, I am not super up on this category, but I can provide you a little bit of information. I do consider this an at-risk category because if you have an ELL plan, an English learning, English language plan, that you're at risk because English wasn't your first language, you have a learning need that's different. But similar to the MTSS general education plan, like the intent is to get you back off the plan. Intent is to increase your proficiency, and there are requirements built into the law for Title III, which is what this falls under, that we should be seeing children making progression towards proficiency and eventually moving off it. Schools here in North Dakota, you are required to have a LEL plan there, and ours is incorporated into our MTSS. You most like a lot of schools will have a ELL coordinator, somebody or instructor that provides targeted instructions to those students who qualify. And in order to qualify, you have to do the access testing and be identified as having a proficiency concern. So that's why I would label it as the at-risk category. There are gatekeeping criterion, and there is something there that's identified as placing you at risk. And so like those are some of the different programs available. And again, general education supports are for everyone. Important to note that. Now I kind of wanted to round out the presentation. I talked a little bit earlier about it, but one thing you might get from parents is, well, if I get my child into this program, X program, what's going to change about my child's education? And that is a very good question. And it should be a question that if you're at a school district that you can provide an answer to. There's nothing magical about saying your child now qualifies for an individual education plan. There's nothing magical about saying you have a 504. If you don't have a good plan, doesn't matter what you call it, it's not going to do a lick of good. So I'm just going to talk about some basics of a good intervention plan. I'll start with the most basic of all. Are you doing it? And that may seem like a silly question, but you'd be surprised how often it comes up. We are all busy. Some of us don't take the time to read all our emails or to be familiar with certain documents. Sometimes there's an awful lot to read. Perhaps you have 5 or 6 kids. However, if you don't know what's in an IEP, a 504, whatever it's called, you can't implement it. If you don't understand what it's asking you to do, you can't implement it. Or if you personally disagree with it for whatever reason, again, 504s and IEPs are legally binding documents, so by law you need to follow them. But if you're not doing it, you can't say it doesn't work. And just to keep in mind when you're doing these intervention plans and you're coming to the meeting, it's very important that you do these interventions with fidelity. And that includes more than just whether or not you're doing it. For example, if a specific intervention requires a certain amount of time in order to make impact, say you're doing read naturally, chances are that program has a certain amount of intended time that it's required to see an effect. Well, if you're supposed to provide 120 minutes in a week in order to reasonably see progress, and you're providing 30, you're not really providing the intervention. You're not giving it enough oomph, so to speak, to make it work. And so you don't have a good plan. So fidelity is very important. So collecting data. Data is great for any of these programs. A lot of times with those general education support, like you're not looking for as specified data where you get up to an individual education plan. You want specific goals, specific measures. So the level of detail varies depending on the kind of need you're trying to get met. But it's kind of like the scientific theory. You have a hypothesis that this child has a learning need, and that to meet that learning need, you'll do X intervention. If you're collecting good data and that student is not improving, then your hypothesis is incorrect and you need a new one. So sometimes we misdiagnose things. Sometimes what looks like an attention deficit disorder is an auditory hearing problem. Or like I even had one case where the kid needed breakfast. It looked like they had an attention problem, seemed like all the common problems. Met at a staff meeting and said, well, he seems hungry. How about we feed him? And it was like magic, I swear. So treating the correct problem and having good data as a part of that is major, because if you're treating the wrong problem, if you have the flu and I'm giving you cold medicine, it's not going to do you any good. Now, having a good team and problem solving is very important. When I put together an MTss team, like you want if you can get special ed involved in that, get your English language learner people involved in that, some of your title coordinators, specialized instruction. Having a good team is very important. You bring different things to the table. I, as an administrator, tend to have a fair amount of experience in the behavior category because, they end up in my office. It's just the way it is. I also have other experience that I can provide to the table, but my special education teacher, they're going to be a little bit more knowledgeable about, what qualifies for a student for specialized instruction, or they can simply provide the team some good strategies they use for students in their setting that are applicable to students perhaps on a 504 or even just a tier 1 MTss plan. Having a good team is very helpful. Having good communication within that team, very helpful. If nothing else, it's good to have that communication going on so that what you're doing in special education isn't being duplicated in a title intervention and then further duplicated in a general education support. And that can happen a lot if you don't have communication going on. Your special ed is trying to meet this one need, and then they're kind of doing the same thing in a title thing. And if they really kind of split up the need and special ed focused on this and title focused on this, more of the child's needs are being met. So that's another good reason for good communication, good teamwork. Again, make sure you're seeing that the interventions are successful. Some things are hard to put your finger on. And sometimes you will determine that something needs more time, needs additional support, or that you don't have the necessary resources to do what you said in the plan. Those are all things you should take a careful look at, and having the good data, good team is all going to help with that. Now, finally, and this is why RTI was renamed MTSS. The reason they renamed it was they wanted to put emphasis on it being a systematic approach. I highly recommend as administrator that if you have this MTSS team, IEP, 504, I don't care, and you're getting a lot of students through there, and that you keep hearing the same problems or that they have the same exact learning need. All these students are struggling with geometry. All these students are struggling with measurement. That may not be a learning need. It may not be a civil rights compliance accessibility issue. You may have a systemic curriculum problem, a systemic behavior problem. In that second category, perhaps your school needs a discipline training for instructors so that you're addressing behaviors in a similar manner and dealing with them. Because if you have 60% of your students making regular trips to the principal's office, it's probably not something that you're going to write behavior plans for 40% of your students. Know that there's a bigger problem going on. So when you identify systematic issues and you see them, these are good places to try to put your finger on it and pay attention to. And it can be easy to fall into the habit of like, okay, we need another plan, we need another plan, we need another plan. However, sometimes the fact that you have these students with needs who aren't meeting grade standards is not actually related to a learning need, not related to an accessibility need. It actually is that your curriculum needs some work. Perhaps you're missing some essential components. Perhaps your curriculum is poorly matched with the demographics of your students. There's lots of different things. Just be on the lookout for it. Oh, just to wrap up, general education, MTSS, RTI, other programs, they have many names and they like to change them periodically. Those are general education supports. They're good faith efforts on the part of the school district to meet your child's needs. They don't need permission to do it. There's no requirement for a legally binding document. Might be documentation. If you're a school district and you're doing these things, document it, give yourself a little bit of credit because it can go a long way to help you with your other programs. Your curriculum is a part of general education. You're using Saxon math, you're using expressions, whatever. That is a part of your general education support. So if you have poor matchup of curriculum to your students or just poor curriculum, that's a general education problem. Classroom accommodations are in general education for all students. Good teachers provide these to students without plans. That is known. Sometimes they don't give themselves a lot of credit. You know, they let certain students sit up close to the front, provide some students extra time. Maybe after they provide the lesson, they go to that student and they provide some one-on-one support. Not all accommodations and interventions fall into at-risk or special education program. Sometimes they're just things that good teachers do. And it's important to note if you implement an RTI, MTSS, or one of those models, it's not something you're sending the kid to. It's about a good system approach. At-risk programming, Title I, Title III, 504s, these things generally have plans. They have gatekeeping criterion. To what degrees tends to vary. In the case of a 504, that's a legally binding plan. Your Title III really kind of is, those two require meetings. Title I, you probably don't have a legally written out plan, but you have a lot of federal reporting requirements and different things to meet. You're trying to target those kids who have been identified for whatever reason as being more at risk of failing. And special education. In a nutshell, your child needs specialized instruction for whatever reason. Doesn't mean that they're unintelligent, doesn't mean that they're not a very good student. They have a specific area in which they struggle, or they have something causing them to need specialized instruction. They need instruction that's different than what's being provided to the general education. And these should be like 5 to 10% of your students. If you have more than that, that could be a signal of a systemic problem. And you know that might be something that originates outside of the school or something in the school, just saying that it is a signal. So I hope you got something out of this presentation. I hope that perhaps this allowed you to have better understanding of how these different programs interconnect and what services they're supposed to be trying to hit, how they're supposed to fit into that continuum so that we leave no child left behind, as they say, and how we can use these things to make sure we're providing good intervention supports and that we acknowledge that there's nothing magical about giving it a name if we're not actually going to carry through on what we say we're going to do. So, hope you found this useful and take care.